Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Griffin. I am the Director of Operations for the Riot Organization. You have found the Riot Lunch and Learn series, the place where we feature all of Riot's partners. I'm super excited to have Lars Mellander with Nemko USA with us today to talk about Beyond the Basics. He's a global market access specialist with Nemko. And I'm so excited for him to be with us today. Before we get started, just a couple of quick reminders. This event is being recorded and will be posted to Riot's YouTube channel and then shared out to the meetup page where you registered for this event. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do put those in the chat box. Lars has agreed to make this an interactive session, so he will be asking for questions throughout the event. And then the last just quick reminder is the best way to view this event is in speaker mode. So if you hit view at the top and put it in speaker view, that'll give you a great view of Lars's presentation and Lars, the speaker himself. Without further ado, I'm super excited to introduce Lars. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Caroline and Shelby, and hello, everyone. Very pleased to have the opportunity to do this presentation. Just a very quick introduction. Nemko is a EMC and safety test laboratory that specializes in international market access. You have your various companies that do testing and EMC and the like, and not necessarily specialize in the global market access. And that is what our specialty is. We've been around for well over 80 years now. I've been with Nemko for coming on 19 years. So I've learned a few things in that time. I'm tall and blonde and Swedish, and I hit my head a lot, but I do learn. So the hope is this is of value. Now, for all of you out there, I just would like to kind of explain when. This presentation was, I made this for training, for global training at Nemko, to show our engineers and salespeople and everything like that, how to best prepare and work with a customer, to have the process go as well as possible, things to think about from the start. I have several customers that kind of keep this on hand, and when they start a project, they go through this presentation and say, okay, well, we check this, and we check this. So now, when going into a project from the testing and certification standpoint, we're essentially dealing with three considerations: EMC testing, electromagnetic compatibility testing, and safety testing, and then any certifications that may go with that. Now, Caroline, I don't know if it's possible to get an indication of, out there, if there's people, are they familiar with the CB, the Certified Body Scheme, and the IE standards and the EN standards? So I'll give just a basic breakdown on that. When you test, and this is primarily for safety, you have many global standards that you deal with. But the primary standards that you want for the basis of your safety testing is the IEC, International Electrical Committee. And that standard is the IEC-based standard. And within the IEC-based standard are the EN, the European norm standards, and that is what is used to mark the product with CE, right? So you have your IEC standards that are for global, and those will be used to get into countries like Russia or China or Taiwan and other countries. And then you have your EN standards, which are in the CB report. They call them the EN national deviations, and that's what you use to create your test report and your EU declaration of conformity. So this gets a teeny bit complicated, but these are the kind of things that if you're working with the laboratory, you need to be well aware of the standards that you're dealing with and where you're going. And this sounds a little bit complicated with all these numbers and standards, but honestly, your lab, whoever you choose to work with, should be well aware of these standards. They should be well aware of the additions and what is the best standard to use. So without further ado, again, this presentation is, again, you guys are starting a project, and these are the things that you very, very much want to consider and have answered up front as much as possible. Over the 19 years within this presentation are all the things that I've seen that can make a project crash and burn or cause serious delays if they're not covered up front. All right. Let's see. So let's move on to the first slide. Okay. Now, what is your product? Okay, so that's pretty obvious, right? Maybe. So, are you making an information technology equipment, ITE? Are you making a tested measurement device, a laboratory device? And don't confuse that with medical, right? Are you making an audio-visual device, right? Are you making a medical device? Now, in the past, of course, this was much easier, right? A PC was a PC, a refrigerator is a refrigerator, right? A medical device was a medical device. But now, with all the new technology changes, you must consider all the possible implications. And I kind of put this as a joke, and it says it's not like the old days when a toaster was a toaster, right? Now a toaster could start your car on a cold morning. Now, obviously, that's an exaggeration, but if you look at your refrigerators nowadays, or your home alarms, or your ring systems, or whatever, you have to consider all the possible standards that may need to be covered within that. Meaning, if your refrigerator has an LCD screen on it, and it's got an identifier, and it's got wireless, and it may have like a temperature monitor or a access point, then the device, it really becomes, a household device, right? But it also becomes a wireless device, right? And then instead of dealing with sort of one directive or one path, which is, household devices, you're then also dealing with the red directive, the radio equipment directive. And this is, again, when you approach your agency and when you approach for testing, the more information you can give the laboratory, everything that you can, the better, right? Because then we or they can help you categorize, right? Now, one thing, you guys, I don't tend to just read slides. You're all very intelligent people. As I'm speaking, you can read, and I'll just kind of fill in the blanks. So I talked about how the devices can be under more than one category, right? Then the other thing now that's quite important is the harmonized shipping codes, right? And that's the harmonized shipping code, or tariff code, or CC code, or whatever. This is very critical to have in the beginning. And the reason is, if you are going globally, right? For Europe, it's not that big of a deal. For the United States, no big deal. You start dealing with countries like China, Taiwan, India, then Mexico in particular. The HS code can often drive what needs to be done. And this can be very frustrating, because your HS code, you'll go to your shipping department or whatever and say, hey, what's the HS code, right? And they'll give you an HS code, and I will tell you 50% of the time it's actually not correct. Or they're using an HS code for some sort of tariff reason or a tax reason or whatever. Now, that might be great for them and for you, but the problem is, if we take that harmonized shipping code and have it and check it with Mexico, right? Mexico has the EFITEL site and all these things. And if that HS code doesn't match up exactly with a Mexican recognized HS code, then you got problems. We cannot get a NOM certification for Mexico. And therefore, we have to work with you to determine an HS code that works, or we have to have discussions about the recategorization of your product and the like. So Caroline and Shelby, how are we doing? I just would, at this point, I kind of like to ask the audience, hey, are you following? Is this what you're looking for? Does that make sense, Caroline? I don't know if anybody can give any feedback.
Absolutely. Again, if you have any thoughts or if you want to answer any of Lars's questions, feel free to use the chat box. You're also welcome to unmute yourself and talk freely. Lars, in regards to your first question, I polled the audience and 11 people said yes, they were familiar. One individual was not familiar with the standard.
Okay.
Yep. And then people in the chat box are saying you're on the right track and everyone's finding the information very useful.
Okay, good. So for those 11 people out there, and for the one person, what I can say, my promise to you would be on those 11 people, even if you've done 1 million CB reports and EMC testing and stuff like that, my goal is for you to learn at least 3 or 4 things, and you kind of knock yourself in the head and say, wow, okay, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do, every time I give this presentation, I get someone come up to me afterwards and said, I didn't know if I was going to go to this presentation because I thought it'd be a little bit basic, but wow, right? You caught some things that we need to think about. And I just, just to stop for a moment, I want to make sure that the presentation I'm giving is of value. So now I feel validated and we're going to move on. Okay, what is your market? Now, again, you guys, this is absolutely critical. Now, the reason, one thing I think it's very important, if you're a project manager and you're in charge of a project, right? There's a part of you that needs to be thinking, what happens if this happens? Or what happens if some sales guy comes up, and says, hey, we need China next week, right? And in the very beginning, they said, oh, no, the only market is the USA, right? So I think it's very important for project managers to cover this. Talk to your sales, talk to your engineers, talk to management, talk to partners, right? And say, guys, this is my understanding of our market and the scope and the goal that we're going. Get it in writing, right? And have that in your back pocket. Because, we all know that some sales guy will all of a sudden come up and say, hey, guess what? I just sold 50 of these devices into Argentina. Let's do it. Let's do it tomorrow. And in the beginning, that they had told you, no, this product is only for China, or no, this is only for USA, right? They need to be aware of the market and your goals beforehand. And again, I always encourage my customers to get that in writing. So later, if something happens, at least you have something to say, guys, you're really throwing me a loop here. And you can't expect me to get this next week when it takes 3 weeks to get an Argentina certification, or it takes 5 weeks to get China and the like. One thing, if your product is going global at all, or there's any potential future, always do your safety. Always do a CB certification scheme and style report. The cost for the CB certification is very minor compared to just an EN or a USA safety-based report. And it's well worth having that certificate in your back pocket in case someone comes up and says, okay, now we need Ukraine, right? If we have the CB report and certification for Ukraine and the EU EMC report, we could submit immediately. If all we had was a CE-based safety testing report or a USA and Canada-based safety report, we then have to go back and upgrade the report to a CB report or to the IEC standards. That's extra cost that's going to cost a lot more later than if you did it in the beginning. So the next one is local importers. So this is changing on a continual basis, right? But there is many countries that you do need a local importer, right? Argentina is a must. Mexico, I don't know if anybody's had to deal with Mexico over the last couple of years, but now Mexico is completely 100% totally Mexican importer based, and each NOM certification must be issued to each importer. Now, Nemko, and it's not that we're special, but Nemko is actually a certified body for Mexico out of San Diego, meaning we can grant Mexico certifications, which is nice for us because we have a lot more control. But people get frustrated because in the old days, you would get a NOM certification for Mexico and then just dish that out. You'd say, here, you give this to Westcon, you give this to Maquiador, you give this to this importer, right? And they could all use the same NOM. That is not the case anymore. Every NOM cert now needs to be issued to the actual importer. Now, here's a case where it's very important that you, and I'll use Mexico for example, but this will happen with many other countries. It's very important that the lab or the agency or the consultant that you're using really knows what's going on in Mexico and how to do Mexico. Because Mexico has paths that you can gain you can gain extension certifications, which are 1/3 of the cost and 1/10 of the time, right? Leveraging a base certification that's already been done. So basically, again, this all comes down to your market, right? If someone calls me and says, hey, I need this for Europe, but in the USA and Canada, but I really need Mexico, we're going to take the time to sit down and have a conversation about exactly how we're going to attack Mexico, right? That goes from picking the standard that we need to have for Mexico, that goes to talking about the importers, that goes to talking about the HS code, that talks about, the requirements that you're going to need. And you guys may be thinking, man, what a pain. I have to talk to somebody for 20 minutes before I can get a quote or get a cert. Let me tell you something. It's either 20 minutes now or 2 or 3 weeks later and a complete disaster. Mexico is a country that must be done right. India is the same, right? Many implications for India. So, but again, a lab that specializes in international or a consultant that's very good at doing international kind of knows all these little tricks and these little trades, right? Some countries are hyper legal, meaning India has all these unbelievably crazy rules about what you can and cannot do, right? And they don't make any sense half the time, and your factory has to be very involved. In India, in the case of India, the cert is actually granted to the factory, and your factory has to sign all this paperwork saying they take responsibility for this or that, and factories freak out and they don't want to do it. But the good news is most factories understand India now and they don't even care anymore. They're just signing the paper and hoping for the best. So, but again, if you have a market that you're going into with this, please, contact your local person, contact Shelby or myself or Caroline, and we can help. So samples needed. Be careful on your samples, right? Because again, what is your market, right? Well, if your market's China, your market is Taiwan, your market's the USA and Canada, right there, you must have a sample for in-country testing for India. If you have a wireless device, right? If you have a wireless device, well, then your samples needed increase a good bit more. For instance, if you're doing Anatel for Brazil, right, you have to send a sample down. Well, for most products, it's changing a bit, but the general short range devices, the ABGNN, Wi-Fi, all that, generally must be tested in country, right? China, if you're going to China, and that product is on the CCC list, right, and it's required, that's a sample you're going to have. So if you haven't informed your team, and you're thinking, okay, well, I'm going to go to China. And this is a wireless product, right? I'm going to go to China. I'm going to go to India, and I'm going to go to Argentina and the USA and Canada. And I got one really nice sample. Wrong. I mean, we could use one sample, but you're going to be waiting forever, right? What you want to try to do is get your sample down to Brazil right away to do the Anatel testing, right? You want to get your safety started, get your EMC testing. And when that starts to get wrapped up and we have the information, then you ship that to India. China, you have a sample ready so that when the safety testing is done, we ship the sample over to China with the test report and we're done. But samples, you guys, are critical, right? I mean, it can be very tough on a manager or a project manager when you have this big plan in place and you forgot to tell your team or your factory that, hey, oh, by the way, we need 4 samples, right? Or we need 1 samples and the project's going to take several weeks longer. So, I mean, I think that's relatively obvious. And again, you guys, like I said in the beginning, right? You're essentially dealing with the EMC, the safety, and then if the product is wireless, you're also dealing with the red directive. These are all things we can help with and assist with. But I think it's quite important. I mean, my 2 rules are you cannot get off a call with a customer without knowing exactly what the device is and what their market is. And if you're a salesperson and they haven't covered that, that's bad. That's bad work. You know, and I mean, I don't want to trash myself, but I mean, that is true, that you guys got to know that. Manuals, labels, translations. This can be a huge nightmare, right? Because you guys, half the time you get some guy throws this thing on your desk and say, hey, here, test this, right? And you're like, okay, that's great. And then you call me and stuff like that and say, hey, what's the model name? Do you guys, what's going to be on your label? Do you have a manual? You know, things like that. And you know, and then you'll say, no, this is the whiz bang 4800, and we're not going to have a regulatory model for another 2 weeks, right? We're not going to have a manual until 2 weeks before the end. Now, I am absolutely sure there is at least half of the 11 people that are on the orange line here on my screen are saying that happens all the time. I guarantee it. Good news is Nemko, we've kind of figured out some ways around it, right? Because generally, you don't need final manuals. You don't need final labels, right? I mean, the regulatory model is very important, right? Because we can't, you know, we need to have that by the time the certifications and the reports are issued, and factories as well. So, I mean, what most countries, 90% manuals will be safety critical only, meaning they don't care how the device operates. They don't care, you know, what the software implications are and things like that, right? They only want to know, hey, if this has 2 power plugins, right? I mean, if you got 2 power cords, don't plug in the wrong one to the wrong one, right? That sort of deal. And we have all sorts of manuals that give you basic, you know, safety, and you can review those, put your trademark on them, and generally we can use that. One other quick thing to think about too is when you're doing your market, you should be aware of software implications as well. In the past, you know, software wasn't a huge deal, but as we go on and on now, there's some countries and there's some products that require some sort of software validation. We often find that in Russia, where they want validation that the software doesn't break their software rules and regulations. Singapore is starting to make some requirements and stuff. But again, back here, when you say, what is your product, right? And you've told them, hey, this is the software we're using, you know, we can cover that. Okay, now, how are we doing for time? Okay, we're good. Power. So power is really important, you guys, obviously, right? What is the power of the device? I mean, is it an AC device? Is it a DC device? Is it USB? Is it battery operation only? Is it dual redundant, meaning you have 2 in there? Is it AC and DC? You know, nowadays there's so many means to gain power, right? There's PoE, there's USB, there's USB 3, there's standard USB. Again, I put this, again, we should get this all on the first slide when we're asking what it is, but this is very critical, you guys. And it will, I mean, it's, if the device has an internal power supply or however it's powered, honestly, is 90% of the testing, right? It dictates 90% of what has to be done. And so in a perfect world, what I like to say, what I like to see is, can you get the CV report and certification for the power supply before the product starts? So meaning when we do a CV report, right, we're going to test everything. And in our critical components list for that report, we're going to have the enclosure, we're going to have the PCB, we're going to have, you know, laser diodes, we're going to have LEDs, we're going to have SFPs, whatever, right? And then the second thing that's going to be listed is the power supply. And it is really heartbreaking when we get 3/4 of the way through a product, and, you know, I've been saying, or the engineer's been saying, hey, I really would like to see the CV report for the power supply, right? And then all of a sudden you get the power supply, and that power supply is either doesn't meet the correct standard, or it's expired, or, you know, they've made minor changes and the trademarks don't match. So really, you guys, your power supply vendors, a lot of them are hesitant to give. They're like, why do you need that? We don't need to send you the whole thing. We need to send you the cert only. That's not true. If you're going global, 8 out of 10 countries will not just accept the CB report for the power supply. They want to see the complete report. And the CBTL rules are very clear. In order to issue a CB report, the CB report for the power supply must be on file with a certification agency. Now, an easy way around that, if you call your power supply vendor, let's say you call, I don't know, Flextronics, Flex, or you call Bell Power or whatever, right? You know, and just say, hey, I want to see the CB report and certification for this power supply. Please send it right away. And the guy's going to say, no way, we're not going to send it to you. Well, then you send it to us, right? You tell them, look, send it to Lars, or send it to Sally that works at UL, or send it to Tom that works at TUV. We can sign NDAs, we can take care of it. You guys will never see the confidential information in the power supply report. And honestly, they will send it because they have to. Okay. So next is, what is the expected life and build of the PSU? Okay. Half of you in this room right now are dealing with the trauma of expected life of parts. I've been doing this a long time, and I have never, ever been in a position where I see shortages of parts or delays in parts. And honestly, the whole world needs to take a huge breath right now. And your sales teams need to take a huge breath. And that's a dream, because your sales team will never do it. Your sales team has to have a little bit of courage and say, guys, look, we're in a global pandemic situation. Foxconn factories were shut down for nearly 3 weeks. Everything is taking longer. PCBs, plastics, power cords, right? We just cannot, it's nearly impossible to meet promise dates for about 50% of the products. And it was fine. You know, what your customers will say, well, wait, 6 months ago, we ordered 6 servers from you and it was no problem. Well, 6 months ago, right, the inventory for the parts and the plastics was there. Now we've run out of inventory, and factories are desperately trying to build new power cords. You know, they're going into their storerooms and they don't have any power cords. They're going into their PCB, you know, they're going to their PCB vendor, and the PCB vendors are saying, no, we don't have any PCBs. Right. So this is very important. And, you know, it's hard to say right now, but I think this is always a great question to ask your power supply vendor or any critical component vendor, right? You know, you can say, hey, I want to buy this Flextronic ABC 400 power supply. What's your expected life, right? And if he says, yeah, we're going to be building that one, oh, that's going to go end of life in 4 months. Well, that's not going to do you any good, right? But if that's the only power supply that you can use, well, then you're going to have to use that for 4 months, but make sure you got a plan in place for the alternate that Flex is going to go with, or another one you can get from Bell Power, etc. You guys, this is very important, and it just is getting more and more difficult. But right now, if you can get a critical component vendor to honestly tell you what the expected build and life of a component is, that will serve you huge. Because let's say you call Flex, and Flex says, yeah, this one's going to be built for 4 months, and you're like, whoa, you know, we plan to sell this for 5 years. You call Bell Power, and they say, oh yeah, we've got this one. It's going to cost a couple bucks more, but it's got a life of 2 years, right? So just, that's kind of obvious. Alternates, right? That kind of goes with what's the expected life, right? A lot of people want to put alternates in their devices, right? They want to be able to have 2 power supplies, or they want to have 2 enclosures, or they want to have several FFPs. This is great. And of course, hard disk drives, SSDs, radio chips, whatever. I mean, this can be no big deal at all if you do your CB report right. And a good example is this. Let's say you have an external hard disk drive or an SSD, which a lot of products do. It actually, I kind of feel it's the responsibility of the lab to come to you and say, hey, listen, we're going to list this Seagate drive or this Intel SSD or whatever, and then underneath it in the components list, we're going to say various or interchangeable. And that line in the report is absolutely critical, meaning because 6 months down the line, you guys are going to have to drop in a new SSD or a new HDD. And if you have that line underneath the initial component listing that says or various interchangeable, as long as the new HDD or SDD that you have has the same rating, certification or less, we don't have to do anything, right? I mean, but if that interchangeable line is not there, and we only have listed one SSD or one HDD, we're in trouble. You call us and say, hey, we put a new HDD in, and there's no line that says alternate, and now we got to test, right? And so a good lab tries to be aware of what can always be put in alternates, but honestly, you guys, engineers are busy, and they do the best they can. And remember, every report they're doing is averaging 80 to 130 pages, and no report's going to be perfect. So when you get the review for the draft, you kind of want to go to that critical components list and see if they've got those lines, right? If they've got the interchangeable or various or whatever, right? And your alternates, some alternates are absolutely, could be no cost at all. Fan is the same way. We can list an alternate fan if it's the same rating or less, and the CFM is the same or higher, no problem. Let's add it in the beginning. I really tell customers, if you know you're going to have alternates, if you're worried about shortages, try to get as many alternates as you can in the CV report at once. Now, that's different with a power supply, right? Because we can't just throw in any power supply. It takes testing. But just be very aware of your critical components list. Study that components list and look for those variants and alternates, right? And if this is confusing or you have questions, we can talk about it later. And then a lot of devices now are powered by external PSUs. And this external PSUs get a little bit tricky, right? Some products you have to include the external PSU in the CV report, right? And so you got to be careful that you're not limited, right? Because external PSUs like HDDs change all the time. But the problem with external PSUs, if you go global, right, even if that external PSU is not in your CV report, the power supply that you're putting into those countries, Mexico, China, whatever, has to have that mark. So when you're selecting an external PSU, get the cheat sheet, get the certs, make sure that the certs that they have on the label are real and are current. And and I even have this is part of our training, right? You can serve a customer very well by also discussing the questions on the external PSU. So if you have a device with an external PSU, just say, hey, talk to your sales representative, the engineer, and say, hey guys, this is my PSU, is it any good? And then they should be able to help you with that. All right, we are at 10:30. Okay, product category. This is quite important, even more so now. So if you're familiar with a test report or a CV report or an EMC report, at the top of the report, it'll have test item description, right? What drives me nuts is when I get a CV report from someone else or something like that, and at the top they've said, the Superstar 4000, whatever, right? And then the regulatory model is the D400, right? Let's say you've got a storage device, and your marketing name or what you guys call it internally is the Superstar 400, right? Don't put the Superstar 400 there. You put what it is: storage, server, modem, switch. That top line is a description of the product. And if you use something goofy at the top of that thing, like the Superstar 400, and I give that to China, China's going to come back and say, what is a Superstar 400, right? But if we get it and it says server, they're like, okay, great. And that's your test item description. Now, the reason this is quite important is globally, there's some very distinct lines about products, i.e. storage. Storage devices do not require China. Storage devices are declaration of conformity scheme for Taiwan. And generally, storage is much easier as opposed to a switch or a server. If it says server, you need China, CCC, you need RPC for Taiwan and other countries, right? And switches, if you put something goofy up on top for the switch and it implies that it's a switch server storage system or whatever, it gets even more so. So, it's it's hard because a lot of times you guys will get an RFQ, right? And it'll say, what is the product at the top, right? And you guys will say, well, we call it the Superstar 400, right? It should be the lab's responsibility to say, no, it isn't the Superstar 400. That's great. That could be your model name and you can put that on your label, but what is it? And then the engineer says, well, it's basically a PC. Great. Then we're going to put PC there. So that's really important, you guys. Yeah. And so this is, again, right, a little note that you can, you know, by getting, for a salesperson or your engineer to get this correct, it's a huge service, right? Because if we get it wrong and we don't, and later have to change or later have to update, it really kind of is a nightmare. So these are a few of the, you know, when I go through this, right, if it's an IT device, you know, I find as it's storage server, medical, if it's a medical device, right, we've got all sorts of considerations, applied part, second part, any part 2 secondary standards, right, like you know, household use or oxygen rich environment or defib proof or, you know, laser functions, whatever. The medical device directive calls out 60601-1 as the basic safety and 60601-1-2 for, you know, for the basic safety. But within that, there's all sorts of secondary. There's biocompatibility, there's laser, there's software validation, there's usability, there's risk management, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, by the time you get a quote, a formal quote from somebody, you should know exactly what you're paying for. And you should know exactly what's covered, because I'm telling you, misses in medical, halfway through, if someone says, oh, by the way, I need a biocompatibility report, dude, your budget's just been shot. I mean, shot, right? And so your lab that you're working with when you're doing medical should be, by the time you get a quote, should have every possible, you know, test and standard considered, as long as you guys didn't, you didn't give us a picture of a, you know, something and then didn't give us all the information. By the way, you guys, it's like 148 degrees here in Idaho. It's great. So measurement, same thing, you guys. What's the environment of use? Is it professional? Is it, you know, anybody can use it? Are there moving parts? Can it heat material? Is it IVD, you know, in vitro diagnostic? What's the size? And then again, any secondary standards, right? Heating, possibly machinery, etc. So again, I've really hammered this product category and what your product is, but it's quite important. Labels and trademarks. Okay, so what we deal with in our industry is the regulatory model name, not your marketing names, not your SN numbers, your part numbers, whatever. We want the name on the label that's going to say model. And then after that, it's going to have what the regulatory model is. You know, if you guys go buy a Dell Latitude laptop, that's great, or an Ultrabook or whatever, Dell doesn't care about any of that. That means nothing to Dell. What they care about is the D47008 that is the actual regulatory model number, and it's on all their reports and all their certifications. So regulatory model names are, you got to be careful, because you can have your regulatory model name on the label, right? The B4000, and then at the top have, you know, the Superstar 8000 as the name that the customer thinks it is, just like a, you know, a Ultrabook or whatever, right? Those trademark, I mean, those sort of marketing names are great, and you can use them as you wish, but it's the regulatory model name that's important. And I can help you with that, or anybody can help you with that. And then of course, trademarks, right? You guys, it's very important for the lab to know what the trademark are or is, and if there's more than one, right? Some countries require a trademark registration. That's not all, but there's like 3 or 4 that do. And if you go to your office and say, hey, I need my trademark registration, and they are like, we don't have that. What are you talking about? Well, then you're kind of like, that's not good. So if when you're issued a quote, the quote should say exactly what's needed for every product, right? And if, for instance, if I'm doing a UAE TRA for wireless for the United Arab Emirates, I know that I need a trademark registration, and in the list of required docs, it's going to say that, right? And you know, then that gives you the opportunity to go to your legal department and say, hey, I need my trademark registration. And they're just like, ooh, that's going to take a couple of weeks. Well, I'll tell you something, it's a lot better if they know at the start than halfway through. What is on the label? We talked about that. What is the trademark? You got to be careful. Some countries allow multiple trademarks. Some countries don't even care about trademark. Asia, Korea, Taiwan, China, they don't care about trademark at all. None. You can do one test for Korea and have 14 trademarks on the various labels, and they don't care at all. It doesn't matter to them at all. Okay. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with the use of a variable in a product. Okay, so let's say you have a series, right? We see this a lot with the internet security devices that have 16 different firmwares or softwares, right? So the model, let's say the model, like your base model is the 4870, right? But within that 4870, you guys kind of have like the 4890, the 48200, the 48 blah, blah, blah. What is really important is you want to get the most for your test dollar, period. So if you say, well, we kind of got a series of products, great. What we're going to do for the regulatory model name, we're going to call it the 48XXXX, right? And then within the report, we're going to say where X can equal A, B, C, D, blank, 0, whatever, right? And then within the body of the report, we're going to kind of cover all the depopulated versions, whether it's via pictures or limited testing or whatever, right? If you are going to make a product that's got an extended life that you're going to update all the time, or there's a series, right? Use a variable in the model name. And so, hey, Caroline, can you maybe just throw that out and say, hey, what's the general understanding of a variable?
Will do.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. You could just maybe say, is anyone familiar with the variable? I just kind of want to make sure I'm staying within the, Okay. Now, okay, so we got to be careful with Mexico and Korea and Israel and some places, right? Because multiple models are not allowed, or you must have the exact model name. Now, remember, in the CB report or the EMC report, we've described the variable, right? So if your CB report is the 6950 and you've got 69XX, right? Well, when we submit to Mexico, we're going to use the 6950, right? As long as it's covered in the CB report or clear in the EMC report, it is. But, you guys, I tell you, the variables save more money for more customers than any other thing you can do practically, right? Because, if you guys have a product, a base model, and then a year from now, you're going to have the 200, the 300, the 400 series, and we haven't added a variable when we could have, and it's exactly the same as the base model, it's just software, then it's crazy. Then we got to go back and add the model, even though there's no testing and it's the same device. But it's not our fault because there should have been a variable. Okay.
Hey, Lars.
Yeah, how we doing? Go ahead.
We have one that says not familiar, one that says we have variables on our products, each variable representing options.
Yes.
And then someone said, yes, same as Leo, our products use variables to indicate software features being enabled.
Perfect. Right. Oh, yeah, that's a great point. So you guys, when we use a variable, we have to be careful, right? I mean, you can't have you can't have a toaster and a refrigerator in the same thing and call it the same thing with a variable, right? I mean, the assumption, you guys, is that we're dealing with similar devices, and that if you're going to have 4 or 5 models in a CB report, right, you can have multiple power supplies. You can actually have different chassis sizes. You can have a 2U and a 1U, as long as both of those are tested. But I mean, the assumption is generally it's a series and the devices are similar, i.e. the motherboard's the same in all, i.e. the power supply is the same in all, i.e. you've got, I mean, from a critical safety standpoint, you need, in a lot of cases, I'll get a sheet that's got a device that's got 3 devices on it, and they're essentially all the same, right? One just has a higher speed, more drives, a different software, whatever. That's easy. We only need 1 sample and we test. But You can also send one and say, well, Lars, we've got this one that's a 1U chassis, and then we have a 2U chassis, but they use different power supplies, but they use the same motherboard, software, form, fit, and function is the same. Well, that's not going to be cheap. I mean, we still have to test, we have to test both models, right? Because they're two different power supplies, but the cost is significantly less. I mean, a lot less, like several $1,000s less, because you're dealing with one report, one cert, and we'll do full coverage of both models in there. But here's the other thing too. If you put it in one report and then we go off to a country like Russia, we can get both those models certified for Russia with one CB report and one certification. We're going to need 2 EMC reports. We're going to need various stuff for RoHS, whatever, right? But and anybody that's interested, if you haven't heard about variables and this totally sounds new to you and you're thinking, maybe we could do this on our next product, or, what are the rules about that? You guys, contact your vendor, whoever you're working with, whether it's us or TUV or UL. And honestly, you guys, they should give good advice. They really should. And as busy as everybody is right now, it's very hard to get good advice. I mean, I'm sure that all of you guys right now are saying it's really hard to talk to labs, and it's really hard to get questions, and it's really hard to get things done. And honestly, you guys, there has to be a mercy factor for all of us. Just like you can't get parts or there's delays for you, all labs are completely slammed. Thank God in San Diego, we have 15 engineers for safety, which is crazy. I mean, that is a huge amount of engineers, and we just keep hiring. Even Seoul, which is great. I mean, it's great that we have that. And I don't want to push Nemko on this call, right? I mean, you guys have all your own services, and UL's great, TUV's great, Intertech's great, but I know it's tough to get answers, but guys, I don't know how you get these answers or the best way to get these answers, but get these answers beforehand, really. Because I mean, if it takes a week to get an answer, right, and you get a good answer, or someone calls you back and tells you what to do, yeah, that's a heck of a lot better than in the middle of the project saying, "Whoa, we don't have a trademark registration." You know what I'm saying? Okay, the importance of being correct. Okay, applicant, manufacturer, trademark, made in country, names, addresses. You guys, this is really important. So there's key information, i.e. the applicant. The applicant is kind of the least important. It's more of a cosmetic deal. Manufacturer, which I can't even spell correctly, but manufacturer is the most important. It's pretty much, well, it's changing a bit, but that's the person in the company building the product, period, right? Not the factory. It's who's building the product. The factory is the factory is the factory. And depending on your relationship with your factory, OEM, ODM, whatever, right? The factory could own the certifications. They could have complete control of the project. That's fine. As long as I know, or your person knows, we can take care of that. Trademarks. Guys, get your most recent trademark, right? Ask your team, whoever's in charge of the trademark and the marketing, get that trademark. And then when they send that to you, you save it in your email. And then later, when the report's done, they said, why'd you use this trademark? You say, well, here, you sent me this. Made in country is pretty obvious. And names and addresses, and stress it's just gotta be correct. So another thing is, guys, a lot of times countries will ask, internationally, will ask for a business license, period. Right. And so you're sitting in your office in Alabama and you're giving me the local address of where you're working and all that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden that you say, oh, I need a business license. Right. Then you go to your legal, and your legal, all of a sudden your business license is somewhere in Oregon. Right. You know what I'm saying? A good example is Dell. Every certification that Dell issues, absolutely every cert is one round rock way. Right? They are just like, hey, this is our corporate headquarters. This is where all our business licenses is, and blah, 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 blah. And it's great. Just try to be careful, because a lot of companies have several different offices. The office you want to use is where your business legal trademark is out of, right? I mean, I have companies that I work with in San Jose or San Francisco or Texas or whatever, and their legal licenses in Indiana or where Idaho, wherever taxes are cheap. Okay, that's pretty That's pretty clear. Now, there has been one change. There's a book called The Blue Book, and it's a very, very good book, but it's nearly impossible to read. But it's all the rules of Europe and CE marking and everything like that. One thing that has changed over the years, and it is in the past, whoever the manufacturer was the person that was responsible for putting it on the market. Now we got to be careful because the EU is changing more to the trademark. So let's say you're Seagate and you build a drive for Dell, right? And it's a Dell model number, it's a Dell trademark, but the actual device says manufactured by Seagate Technology LLC, and it's got a Dell trademark with a Dell model number. Now, recently, it is the trademark. It's the actual person putting it on the market. Now, 90% of the case, that's the manufacturer, but you do have cases where the person putting it out to the market is actually the trademark owner, right? I mean, you're not putting it out in the market, you're building it for someone else and they're putting their trademark on. And you guys, that gets a little bit complicated and all that kind of stuff. But honestly, I swear almost anything done under the sun, I know, or your good salespeople at other agencies should know, and we can help you walk through that. We are good. Oh my gosh. Factory. Okay. Factory, you guys, factory is very important. And you got to be careful because what happens with factories, and many of you know this, is you'll say, what's the factory address, right? And they'll give you something in Guangdong, China, right? And it'll say this, right? And then when we get the actual inspection report or we get whatever, the actual place, it's like 7 blocks down the street, right? And they gave you the office address, not the physical location of the factory. And then we're doomed, right? Because the inspector goes there and says, well, Lars, you know, we went there and it's just an office. You know, 6 blocks down the street's their actual factory. Well, and it's too bad. And that's really bad because we've already put the factory in the CB reports or the NRTL listing, you know, and now we got to go back and update, right? And so factory is very important primarily for China. India, it's absolutely vital. If you're doing India, you know, we or whoever you're with can discuss it, but that factory has to be correct. And there's all these things that factory has to sign. And if they're not willing to sign it or they have no idea what's going on, it's going to add you a couple extra weeks, right? We generally, if we run into a new factory, we force the end customer to say, hey, you need to get Sally or Bob in China to get on a call with Nemko right away, and we'll discuss it. And we help them set it up. We'll go on the site with them, the actual registration site, and walk through them and share screens and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Okay, international certifications. Again, this one we can kind of read. Addresses can make or break certifications. Okay, you're going to get a draft report from an engineer. And I don't know what your policy is or who you're working with, but your policy should be before you issue a final report, I want to see the draft, period. That is your right. You're paying good money for these things. Now, that engineer should send you a draft. And on top of it, it should say draft. And it's your job to go through and make sure things are correct. And you know what? There's mistakes made. And then you might have sent an RFQ with the right information, but the engineer got it wrong, or, you know, something was wrong with the critical components or whatever. Look, it's got to be a two-way street, you guys. Meaning, yes, engineers need to be careful and full of detail and all that kind of stuff. But your job really is to review that final draft report. And if there's any questions, check your critical components list to make sure that all of them are right. Check to make sure there's various. Check to make sure the factory is right. Check to make sure the trademark's right. I mean, this is all obvious stuff. But please, you guys, check your draft report very carefully. And I'll tell you, on our side, and then do it quickly. That's another thing, right? Sometimes we send out a draft report and the customer's like, I'm really busy, I can't get it to you for a month. And we're just like, no, that doesn't work for us. We can't hold an open project for a month. So it's kind of your job to go through and review that draft and then come back with any questions and say, hey, can you do this? Can you do that? Okay. So then multiple trademarks, right? We kind of talked about this. You can have multiple trademarks in one CB report. The only thing you got to be careful about that, you guys, is that you may have a customer, you may have a product, it's the exact same product that you're selling to 3 different customers with 3 different trademarks, and you don't want those other customers to know, right? That you're selling the same thing to 3 people. That's no problem at all. There's three ways around that. We can do variant CB certifications with only that trademark and only that model, or we can do 3 duplicate reports, which is, tiny. It's a very low cost. So that way you have an individual report to give out. Made in country. So the last thing about made in country, you got to be careful, because some countries, some companies, right? Like, a drive will be made in Singapore, but they actually make it in Taiwan or China. And what's the country of origin, right? Meaning, the drive is 80, 90% of the product, right? So where's the product really made? I'm sure some of you have dealt with that, right? You've seen labels that say made in China with parts from here or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then you got to be careful, because this is the dumbest thing ever, but some countries will require made in on the label, right? Which, this is the dumbest thing ever, because a lot of times you can't say made in. It's illegal to do so, right? You have to say assembled in. And we dealt with this a million times. There's ways around it, but just, again, if we know your market, right? That's something that I'm going to flag and say, well, that's going to be a problem for India, because it says assembled in and they want to see made in. Okay. Critical components, we much talked about this. Boy, we're getting in here. Customers want flexibility, certifications. Yeah, we talked about this pretty much. You guys talked about the various and the like. Alternates, we talked about. National certifications, we've talked about this too, a bit, right? Some critical components can be UL listed, right? Like fans or fuses and things like that. They don't have to be IEC. But again, when we go through that and we get the parts, we'll tell you what certifications we have to see. And don't go overboard with critical components. Oh, this is a huge one, you guys. A lot of times your guys will say, I want a critical components list, right? Your engineer. And so you send them like a bomb or something. And then all of a sudden you get a critical components list with like 500 things on it. That is horrible. And the reason that's horrible is then every time you change one of the 500 reports, components, you have to update the CB. In your critical components list should be as limited as possible. I'm not saying cheat, but don't put anything on a critical components list that doesn't have to be there. That's just murder. Power supplies, we talked about. Battery packs, you guys. Battery packs, you guys. I tell my customers there's 2 things you really need to worry about. The wireless certifications for the USA and Canada are critical. You will get stopped, you will get fined. I see it all the time. Not to scare you, but that's one where I'm just like, you guys got to get that right. Batteries, you got to get right. They got to be safe. They got to be certified. You got to have good protection circuitry. You must do the correct testing. And there is many ways to screw up battery pack testing. And with all the different standards we're dealing with now, it can be very confusing. And then when you do battery packs, there's all sorts of stuff you need. You need additional battery packs. You need this. You could need plastic samples. But again, a good quote will tell you exactly what's needed. So you guys this is kind of the final thoughts, right? And basically all I'm saying here is that, look, you've got sales and you've got engineering. And the sales, they don't understand anything half the time. All they understand is money, right? And unfortunately, a lot of companies are sales driven. Right. And they don't understand when they come to you and say, hey, I need 20 units shipped to Russia tomorrow. Right. So it's impossible. And it's getting more and more difficult as countries get more difficult and the like. So, but what I can say is that, if you have met with your sales team or your manager and tried to lay out everything that you can and say, hey, guys, look, don't come to me and say we need China in a week when you know what I'm saying. And that way, you have coverage. You have a history of saying what you said you can and cannot do. And of course, that may have no value at all, because the sales guy could go to the manager and scream and whatever. And but at least you're trying your best. Yeah. So yeah, Caroline. Wow, that's pretty much it, Caroline and Shelby.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lars. Excellent run through The breadth of challenges in addressing worldwide markets for new products, says Jim Mextra. Thank you, Jim.
Right.
There was one question earlier.
Sure.
You had indicated that India has a tendency to be unreasonable for product certifications. Can you elaborate on that? This individual is from India, and they just wanted a clarification of the certification requirements.
Okay. Okay. Not to miss. Okay. So here's my problem with India is that India is a member of the CB scheme, right? They are, so countries are members of CB schemes, right? The USA, China, whatever, right? And the whole purpose of a CB scheme is that one test, one report, and you get your certification, right? India, for some reason, is allowed to demand in-country full testing and still be a part of the CB scheme. And honestly, Caroline, I think that's wrong. I very much think that's wrong because the whole purpose of the CB scheme is the acceptance of viable data from CBTL laboratories. I get frustrated because we will produce a beautiful CB report, right? And now the customer has to take that exact same device, send it to India, and get the exact same testing again, exactly the same. There is no difference between the IS and the IS standards and the American or the EN or the the IEC based standards. So I do think, that's not fair. And I don't want to get political, but honestly, I don't think they should be in the CB scheme because they're not following the CB scheme rules, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that, and I will tell you this, if you've got a great team in India, right? That team in India, if they really know what's going on and they really know how to run BIS, it can be easy peasy. If you've got a team in India that's run 100 BIS certifications before, they got their local lab, they're going to take it to the lab, they're going to get it done, they're going to meet with BIS, they're going to go into the BIS office and give them the things, and then pretty soon they'll get their BIS, and they have good relationship with the factory. It can be, it doesn't have to be hard, but it can be more challenging if you don't have representation in India, right? If your factory is not, registered, right? Meaning, if we do for the CE marking, we get a report, you guys write a self-declaration letter for the EMC and the safety, and you're kind of done, right? Whereas India, you've got to get a lot of steps involved, right? You've got to send samples to India, which is not cheap. And customs clearance and all that stuff can be very difficult if you don't do it right. And then after you get the sample there, right, you got to be very careful with the components list, right? Because what they accept on components list is a little bit different, right? And then they have market surveillance. And market surveillance can be really hard because let's say, 2 years down the line, they pull a product and do market surveillance. And for some reason, a drive was changed or some minor thing was changed and it's not on your India, critical components list. Well, then you got to go back in there and pray that they don't suspend your certification or cancel. They usually will just suspend it. And then you got to fix that, right? Which, that's all well and good. It's not, believe me, I don't have anything against, the country or the people or the system, but I do think that they are in violation of the CB rules. I don't think it should be fair. You know what I mean? It's Mexico doesn't ask for it. The only other country that asks for for sample in country for safety and for EMC and safety is China. China is a little bit smart because they will accept a CB report and do no safety testing, but they will do EMC testing, right? So they kind of skirt that. They still want to get all the EMC testing they can, but safety is easy because we just give them the CB report. And they got to be really careful with India, you guys, because the rule is you cannot use your CB report for India, period. End of story, right? And meaning if you can use the CB report to make critical components lists and all that kind of stuff, or a consultant can, but I'm telling you right now, the last thing a lab should have is your CB report. Because if the lab, for some reason, is caught with a copy of the CB report, or something happens that they figure out that, oh, you know, a CB report was used for this, the lab will be suspended and your project will die. And I'm not just making that up. You know, fortunately, we're the only major lab, and I'm not just saying this, and maybe it's just dumb luck, but Nemco's the only lab that hasn't. The only like UL, TUV, CSA, all the major labs that hasn't been suspended. And I don't, you know, I mean, we run a very, very tight ship in India, but you know, who knows? It could be dumb luck too, you know. But so
That's super helpful.
yeah, well, I think that customer and that person is saying, well, hey, I'm in India and I do BIS all the time. It's no problem. Well, it's because it's because he's in India. He has the relationships, and you know, he knows what's going on. You know, it's just. I would say that, you know, from the American side, with someone that has no idea what's going on, India is much more challenging than like CE. That's kind of what I'm saying. So I hope that satisfies that answer.
Thanks, Lars.
Yeah.
Well, that is out of time, but if you'll advance to the next slide, Lars, so people know how to get in touch with you, you can, of course, always reach out to me, Caroline, at riot.org. I want to thank you, Lars, for this wonderful, very informative presentation, and thanks to Shelby as well on your team for helping get this all set up. But again, this presentation was recorded. You'll be able to find it on Riot's YouTube channel and on the meetup page where you registered. Thanks, y'all. I hope y'all have a great day.
Hey, Caroline, one thing. Are you going to be able to give them a hard copy of these, a PDF of this presentation?
Absolutely. If you email it to me, I will actually send it out with the video.
Yeah, and then maybe, because like I said, you guys, I don't want, you know, I'm not telling you what to do, but I do have a number of customers, right? They start a project and they go here and they say, oh, they do this, blah, blah, blah. They use it like a cheat sheet. My only thing is, this presentation is confidential, right? I mean, it is for use only of people that are associated with this, and it's covered under our NDA. I don't necessarily want UL or TUV or somebody else to have this. So just if we send it out, just, you guys are going to be fine. Right.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks so much, all. This has been a really good time, and I hope it's been helpful.
Have a great day, y'all. Thanks, Lars.